Welcome back to Fundamentals of Philosophy. This is part 3 of our 3-part lecture on Module 2 on reasoning. So, in parts 1 and 2, we trace the genealogy of deductive and inductive reasoning from Aristotle's syllogistic clockwork through the martyrdom of Semmelweis, and we witnessed how empirical testing can both support and challenge our theories. Part 3, we turn to a critical examination of the machinery of scientific reasoning itself. In their analysis of Antiscientism, Gillian Barker and Philip Kitcher note that the vision of the clockwork universe described in the first lecture succeeds in delivering on its promise of predictive power and technological mastery, but that this success comes with a cost. Prior to the scientific revolution, the cosmos of the Western philosophical tradition was saturated with meaning and purpose, it seemed to be at least. Humans occupied a central place within a universe that had a reassuringly human sort of scale. Modern science seems to strip away these illusions, branding us in a disenchanted world that is unimaginably vast, empty, and indifferent to human concerns. Very Lovecraftian. In the universe of modern logic and science, the stars seem emptied of purpose, and no meanings exist beyond those that we project with the screen. This disenchantment creates fertile ground for anti-scientific attitudes, just bluntly put. Evolutionary biology appears to diminish our essential humanity, right? Climate science condemns us for our choices while heralding our impending extinction. And we're both, our actions are both very consequential and yet completely inconsequential because we are very small parts of a giant machine that is approaching catastrophe. These are not the sorts of notions that typically invite dispassionate reasoning or emotional neutrality. People tend to have strong feelings about this stuff, right? And in our hyper-mediated culture, which ensures that expertise and propaganda sort of have the same volume, right? They merge into what Barker and Kitcher call this cacophony of voices, all competing for likes, clicks, and ad revenue. This manufactured image of scientific controversy emerges, which drives media engagement, even when the actual scientific consensus is overwhelming, as in the case of climate change. Reading Barker and Kitcher through Susan Stebbing's distinction between twisted thinking and crooked arguments can be helpful here. Much resistance to science involves what Stebbing calls twisted thinking. People genuinely believe they're reasoning effectively when they're actually practicing something that's more like psychological self-protection, right? But where there is profit to be made from manufactured controversy, there will always be incentives for crooked arguments, as the sophists understood well. So this disenchantment of nature reached its sort of philosophical apex in the 1920s in Vienna, where a group of philosophers gathered to complete the project that Russell and Whitehead had started. They were led by a guy named Schlick, and another guy named Rudolf Carnap, and they were called the Vienna Circle. This is where logical positivism started. And what they were attempting to do was to complete what they saw as the scientific revolution's unfinished business of grounding all knowledge in foundations as solid as mathematics. To achieve this, these early logical positivists developed what they called the verification principle, which stipulated that a statement is meaningful if and only if it can be verified through empirical observation or is analytically true by virtue of logical form, so by definition. Everything else, ethics, aesthetics, theology, metaphysics, was literally meaningless. It was nonsense. You're just making noises with your mouth. You're not even saying anything. It's what Carnap calls pseudo-statements. It's not even wrong, right? Because to be wrong, you'd have to be saying something coherent, and you're not. You're just speaking nonsense if you're talking about ethics or metaphysics. This was the Enlightenment dream pushed to its absolute limit, an engine of inference that would finally establish the ultimate line of demarcation between genuine knowledge and meaningless nonsense. Here at last, philosophy had achieved the mathematical precision of the predicate calculus while maintaining empirical grounding and observation. The disenchantment of nature was complete. And then the project exploded. The verification principle, as it turns out, was itself self-refuting. The principle that stated that meaningful statements must be either empirically verifiable or analytically true. The problem is that statement is neither empirically verifiable nor analytically true. The algorithmic filter had devoured itself. H.A. Ayer, who was one of the influential logical positivists, introduced the concept to the English-speaking world. He later admitted, with a sort of commendable honesty, that nearly all of it was false. It was unsustainable. From outside the circle, the philosopher Karl Popper proposed an alternative. Science progresses not through verification, but through falsification. And this sort of maps on to the distinction we've been talking about with deduction and induction, modus ponens and modus tollens. Scientists should seek to relentlessly refute theories rather than to confirm them. Those that survive may become provisionally accepted, but they're never proven. This was a more modest project than the verification project of the logical positivists, but there are other challenges that were still going to come. Philosophy of science wasn't done yet. What happened was a guy named Thomas Kuhn published a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions that kind of blew everything up. 2 explosion metaphors in 1 lecture. I want to back off on that. Kuhn was trained as a physicist, and when he studied the actual history of science, what he discovered contradicted everything that the positivists had claimed. Science does not progress through the steady accumulation of verified facts or the patient falsification of theories. Instead, it sort of lurches through revolutionary transformations that Kuhn called paradigm shifts, a word that you've probably heard used out of context and incorrectly a lot. During periods of what Kuhn calls quote-unquote normal science, researchers work within an accepted paradigm, which is a sort of comprehensive framework that defines what questions are worth asking, what methods are considered appropriate, and what counts as a legitimate answer. That it basically defines everything that matters about what's going to show up as a valid theory. It's the conceptual scaffolding. Again, normal science was essentially puzzle solving, with the conceptual scaffolding of the scientific paradigm defining what counted as a piece of the puzzle. There's this notion back in the days of Newtonian physics that all the discoveries had been made and everything else was just problem solving. It was just sort of tinkering and technical stuff. And then Einstein happened, and then quantum mechanics. So we've thought that a few times. And the thing with normal science is that anomalies begin to accumulate. The center cannot hold. Eventually, the paradigm enters what Kuhn calls crisis. What follows is less like a logical transition to a new paradigm and more like a political revolution. The new paradigm that emerges cannot be proven superior by the standards of the old, because each paradigm defines its own standards of truth. It defines the language game. And paradigms, in Kuhn's sense, are incommensurable. That means they are speaking entirely different languages. They can't translate. Words have different meanings within the context of different paradigms. New paradigms don't answer the same questions better, right? They ask entirely different questions. To the positivist vision of a purely rational science, This conclusion was devastating. But despite Kuhn's concerns, science did not, in fact, immediately dissolve into sociology. John Worrall was one of many people in this process who identified yet another curious fact in the history of the progression of science. Kuhn, according to Worrall, was correct that the revolutionary nature about the revolutionary nature of theory change, but the structural core of causes and relations remained constant across paradigm shifts. There was something that survived the shift. The theories changed, the form, the content of the theories changed, but the form was consistent. This insight, which Worrall termed epistemic structural realism, explained why Newtonian mechanics remained useful even after it had been superseded by Einstein's relativity. The mathematical relationships Newton identified, they weren't wrong. Einstein's equations contain Newton's as a limiting case. The structure persists, even as our ontological interpretation of the content changes, right? So, I mean, it's not that we're seeing different patterns in nature. We're looking at the same thing now that people in the time of Newtonian physics were looking at. We're just using different terms. And the patterns are consistent. The patterns stay the same. That's the insight. And here again, what we're seeing is Aristotle's distinction between form and content, right? We can grasp the relational scaffolding of reality, but what fills in that scaffolding remains beyond our grasp, right? We don't know what is behind the patterns, what is generating this consistent causal structure. And that kind of raises an interesting question. And we're going to see this a little bit again when we talk about Kant in the next module. If all we can ever know is structure, right? Then what justifies our assumption that any content exists behind the form at all? Why isn't it just structure all the way down? Why are we making this ancillary assumption that there is content behind the form? And James Ladyman and Don Ross put out a book a few years back, by which I mean like a decade or two back, that sort of pushes this question to its logical conclusion. It's a very influential book called Everything Must Go, in which they formulate something called ontic structural realism, which bites the metaphysical bullet put forward by that question and declares that there is no content behind the form. It's form all the way down. The universe is not made of objects with properties that stand in relations. Structure itself is all that exists. And this is sort of similar to like Max Tegmark has a theory of a mathematical universe. It has some resonances with Plato's theory of forms that we'll talk about later. Objects in this case are just pragmatic devices that we use to navigate regions of space-time. That's it. They're heuristics. All that exists ultimately is structure. There's nothing behind it. So, meanwhile, while philosophers of science were debating whether or not objects were real, feminist philosophers like Janet Kourany noted that a crucial component had been excluded from all of these conversations, which was the embodied, situated, and political nature of literally all knowledge production. Who funds the research? That seems like an important question to ask, right? Science doesn't occur in a vacuum. You have to have money to be able to perform experiments. Your department has to fund it. There has to be grants, and these grants are provided by people with agendas who want to see some outcome rather than another. Who decides what questions are worth asking? Whose interests are served by particular findings, by the outcomes? You know, there's the prediction crisis in psychology, for those of you who are on a psychology degree track. There's lots of pressure when it comes to publication to not publish null results. There are specialized journals that will insist that you cite the right people and that you only publish things that agree with the particular ideological lens that the particular journal itself occupies. And this is, I work in library science as well, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of journals, each of which occupy some little niche that some special perspective within this constellation. All of this has an influence. The academic publishing industry has a tremendous impact. Administration in universities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The recent federal funding of federal grant funding recently has been a target. All of these factors, from Kourany's view, I mean, they're not something from the outside. They're not extraneous. They're constitutive of scientific practice itself. They're essential. They're part of the nature of science. Inferential engines don't operate in a vacuum. They're always embedded in networks of power, shaped by the prejudices and priorities of their operators, or in this case, their funders. The tragedy of Semmelweis takes on a new meaning through this lens, right? He wasn't simply rejected out of, like twisted thinking and Stebbing sense, or institutional blindness, error, just bureaucratic red tape. Deep structures of class and gender prejudice were operating behind the scenes. Excuse me. The idea that gentlemen doctors might have dirtier hands than working class midwives was literally unthinkable within the conceptual scaffolding of 19th century medicine. They did not have the conceptual tools at hand to be able to make that sort of distinction. The inferential engine couldn't process data that challenged the social hierarchies that sustained it. Science doesn't transcend politics. It operates through them. But despite some uncharitable characterizations, caricatures, feminist philosophy and philosophy of science are not natural enemies. There is to give an example, a different form of response to scientific disenchantment has recently emerged and become influential from within physics itself. And this comes from Barad, who was trained as a theoretical physicist before transitioning to feminist philosophy, feminist and gender theory. What they did was they leveraged, they leveraged the tools of quantum mechanics, which was their specialty, to analyze issues in ethics, gender, and political philosophy. Together with thinkers like Jane Bennett, Barad represents what is sometimes called the new materialism, or the posthumanist turn in the metaphysics of science. Whereas the Vienna Circle attempted to purify knowledge by severing all facts from values, Barad demonstrates that the quantum revolution itself undermines this separation, in fact, all separations. In the world of quantum entanglement, the measuring apparatus and the measured phenomenon cannot be independently defined. I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds on this. But they emerge together through what Barad calls material discursive practices. So what she's trying to do is she's trying to bring science and culture together. She's trying to generalize the logic of quantum mechanics, not the logic, but the actual laboratory experimental evidence of quantum mechanics. She's trying to apply that beyond that domain. And Ladyman and Ross are kind of doing this too, although they describe their project differently. They're applying it to all of science and saying, well, quantum mechanics tells us this is all just structure. Barad is going to generalize this out and say, okay, well, we can, if we know that this goes all the way down, then we can use it as a tool to analyze ethics, politics, gender, etc. That it should apply generally. That this notion that there is a big split between meaning, the enchanted sort of what the positivists sort of dismissed as an enchanted universe, between that and the hard sciences, that's unsustainable. The fact-value dichotomy doesn't hold. So Barad intends this as a fully ontological rather than merely epistemological claim, right? Reality itself, for Barad, is fundamentally relational. Matter and meaning, nature and culture, subject and object, emerge together through our experimental interventions. And there are other people like Whitehead went down this road with process philosophy. John Dewey with his transactional sort of pragmatism. Barad does it specifically through the lens of quantum mechanics. Every measurement, every observation participates in the ongoing materialization of the world. So we're all participants. And Barad, in this way, kind of heals the rift that had seemed to separate feminist critiques of science from scientific practice itself, which, again, was a bit of a caricature. The social construction of knowledge and the material construction of reality are not opposed, but entangled. Yeah, she's taking that entanglement and generalizing it out. Our theories, instruments, and social arrangements all participate in bringing forth the phenomena that we study. Bennett, Jane Bennett, kind of takes this even further, arguing that matter itself possesses a kind of distributed agency. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into the free will module in Module 5. Bennett calls this thing power. The disenchanted world of dead matter obeying mechanical laws gives way to a vibrant materiality, where even seemingly inert objects participate in complex assemblages of action and meaning. And there's a lot packed into that I do not have the time to get into. I recommend her book, Vibrant Matter, which is really good. Barad's book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, is also excellent. Through these new materialist lenses, quantum mechanics and feminist theory converge on a singular conclusion. Enchantment was never banished, because the separation of matter from meaning was always artificial. It was always an after-the-fact determination. What Whitehead would call a fallacy of misplaced concreteness. The universe isn't re-enchanted from outside by projecting human values onto an indifferent cosmos. Meaning and mattering are entangled throughout reality itself. The world is meaningful. Always was. So take a moment to compare these different universes that emerge from these different philosophical frameworks, how dramatically different the world we live in looks depending on which one of these views we take, depending on the conceptual scaffolding, right? Logical positivism offers a cosmos that is drained of everything but verifiable facts. Statements about ethics, beauty, or meaning, any metaphysics, any of that stuff, or they're just meaningless noise. You're just making sounds, but you're not saying anything. It doesn't have any content. It's not even wrong. Kuhn shows us incommensurable islands of meaning that shift with each paradigm change, right? You can't talk to each other across the gulf of one paradigm to another. Structural realists present reality as pure pattern, mathematical forms without substantial content. The new materialists suggest a cosmos that is simultaneously material and meaningful, structured and creative, and determined and open. The inferential engines we construct are not separate from the world in this view, but part of its ongoing self-articulation. We are not outside observers discovering truth, but participants in the universe's creative becoming. We cannot be otherwise. It's not a choice. We can't stop participating in this process. We're always already in the thick of it. In the words of Spinoza, we are no more and no less than what he calls natura naturans, nature naturing. We are nature naturing. We are nature. We were never not nature. The question is not whether the world is enchanted or disenchanted, but instead, what kinds of worlds do our inferential practices help bring into being? What realities do they materialize? And what possibilities do they foreclose? What kinds of world, what possibilities are we shutting down by living within the belief systems that are handed to us rather than challenging them? And in our next module, probably a good place to end here, Next module, we will take a deep dive into the question of epistemology itself. What sort of thing is knowledge? And what does it mean to possess it? And I will see you then. Take care.